The sudden resignation and disappearance of the Bishop of Galway has focused attention on the question of celibacy amongst priests. Although they vow to refrain from sex, there have been claims that relationships between Catholic clergy and parishioners are far from rare. And it's said that the Church sometimes pays off women from slush funds while allowing the priests to continue their ministries. One man who tries to counsel priests who have sexual relationships and has suffered for it is Father Pat Buckley, who joins me now from Dublin. Good evening to you, Father.
Well, good evening, Bob. How are you?
Very well indeed, thanks very much. Naive, ordinary people, perhaps like me, would have been shocked by the revelations about the bishop. But is this going on all over the place?
I think it is. We don't really understand properly the long history of the celibacy issue. In the very beginning, Catholic priests and bishops married. And in fact, St. Peter in the New Testament was married. And St. Paul said that the bishop should be the husband of one wife. So the scriptural tradition is that bishops and priests were married. Now, we had married clergy in the Catholic Church right up until the 12th century all over the world. And we had them in Ireland until the 14th century.
But we're not living in the 14th century now. We're living in whatever it is, 1992. And we do expect celibacy from priests who vow to be celibate in front of God.
Right, well, this is not true, you see, because most priests don't take vows. It's only monks who take vows. A priest makes a simple promise at his ordination to be celibate and not to marry.
But the ordinary parishioner expects a priest not to have sexual relations with a woman.
Well, you see, this is a wrong expectation, because originally priests were allowed to marry. They did marry for most of the Church's history, and they should be allowed to marry again. And the fact that they're not allowed to marry openly is forcing some bishops and priests to form illicit liaisons, and it's forcing other bishops and priests to have psychological problems and mental breakdowns, and indeed alcohol-related problems.
But when someone, for example, goes in the confessional and the priest listens to the confession, he or she is not expecting that priest to slip quietly between the sheets with one of the other parishioners.
No, well, that's true, and many priests don't do that, of course. Many priests retain their celibacy. But the first book of the Bible tells us that it's not good for man to be alone. And there are bishops and priests who are suited to celibacy, and they must remain so. But there are other bishops and priests who are not suited, and therefore we should have optional celibacy like we had in the beginning, and like we had for so long even in Ireland and other parts of the world, so that we'll have happy celibate bishops and priests and happily married bishops and priests.
What do you say then when someone comes to you for counsel and they say to you, perhaps in the privacy of your own home, look, I'm having a sexual relationship with a young woman. What do you say to them?
Well, there are two things I think that have to be said. First of all, you have to find out if the woman and the priest are happy in their relationship, and if he wants to leave the priesthood. I mean, if that's what he wants to do and the lady's happy with that, then he can leave. Unfortunately, the Church officially won't let him leave now, but I'm quite happy to help a priest like that to marry. The other case is where a man wants to stay in the priesthood and he's very happy, but he's still in a relationship, and the lady is happy with him remaining in the priesthood. And given the fact that the obligatory celibacy is an unjust law, I see nothing wrong with the priest staying in the priesthood and also having his relationship.
But what about the possibility of a child being born?
Well, this has happened before. I mean, in Ireland, two of our most common surnames are McAnespy, the son of the bishop, and McIntaggart, the son of the priest. So there's a long history of children being born to bishops and priests. And of course, in this kind of case, I think it's incumbent upon the priest or the bishop, who's the father, to look after the woman and the child. And this is one of the scandals of the present case, because it appears as if Bishop Casey has been somewhat remiss in his responsibilities to his friend, the lady, and especially to his son, Peter.
Do you think that the priest should be encouraged to break another tenet of the faith, as it were, and practice birth control?
Well, I mean, obviously, the fact that very, very few relationships between priests and women end up in a child being born means that contraception is practiced by couples like this. In the 1970s, when Bishop Casey had his relationship, contraception wasn't freely available in Ireland, and perhaps if it had been, we wouldn't have had part of the present controversy.
How do you think, though, ordinary members of the Catholic congregation, let's say elderly women who've gone to church regularly and they hear about this sort of thing, doesn't that tend to strain their faith a bit?
I think it should. It'll probably shock many, and it has indeed. But I think it'll do good for the Church in the long run, because it will remind ordinary Catholics that their popes and their bishops and their priests are only human beings like everybody else and have the same needs as everybody else. And we forget, for instance, that in the Middle Ages we had Pope Alexander VI, who had 14 children while he was on the throne of Peter as Pope.
Father Pat Buckley, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
And that's where we'll take another break.